Guido Hülsmann, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks, gentlemen, for having me.
So, Paul, you had some intelligent questions to ask, so I'll let you ask your intelligent questions first.
Well, first of all, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. If you could just explain to people a little bit about your background.
Sure. I am a professor of economics at the University of Angers in Western France. That's not very far from the Atlantic. It's not very far from Nantes. So it's some 200 miles southwest of Paris. I've been there for 20 years. Before, I've been a senior fellow at the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. And before that, I've been at various universities, brief stints as a research fellow in France, in the US. And I've started off my academic training in Berlin at the Technical University. I've studied mechanical engineering, economics, management. I've studied for a year in France at the Toulouse Business School. And I've also studied philosophy at the Free University of Berlin. So I've quite wide-ranging research interests, but I've especially worked for many years on a biography of Ludwig von Mises, who is an economist that I admire very much. And I had the good fortune to be hired by the Mises Institute precisely for that project. So they spent a lot of money on me during those years. And I produced a very massive Mises biography that was published in 2007. I've also worked a lot on money and financial markets. At the University of Angers, I'm directing a master program in law and finance. And I'm also currently working on various projects related to finance, but also foundations of economics.
Would it be fair to would you be happy to be described as an Austrian school economist then?
Yes, I think that that's fine. Yeah. So I mean, if you like Mises and if you spend quite a few years of your life on Mises, probably you must like Austrian economists. Even though there's a whole industry of people, especially in France, but also I think in some other countries, where people specialize in bashing the Austrians.
I think you'll find that's particularly common in the UK and in the likes of the Financial Times, which has been completely overrun by Keynesians.
Yeah.
Or possibly Marxists.
Yeah. And I find this okay. I mean, that you would also spend some time looking at authors with whom you disagree and so on. So that's, of course, important, especially to sharpen your own arguments and your own view of the world and so on. That's fine. But there are really people who are doing this apparently for a living. They just go around and criticizing whatever they don't like in Austrian economics. Seems to be very destructive, not constructive. So if you don't agree with an opinion, well, you first of all you have to propose something better in its place.
For people who aren't familiar with the Austrian school, which I suspect is the minority of our listeners now, hopefully, the way I would describe it in three very short ways would be, it's a belief in, as I understand it, a belief in sound money, small government and libertarian principles. Is there anything you'd add to that?
Well, that's a practical offshoot. And I think it's a very good characterization as far as the practical implications are concerned. But as a scientific enterprise, Austrian economics is an offshoot of realist philosophy, which comes really from antiquity. It comes from Plato, Aristotle, and then runs through all the European Middle Ages and into the modern times. And what realism is all about, that you believe in there's something like universals, that is, universal concepts and universal causal relationships, which exist at all times in all places. That's really what Austrian economics is about. So Austrians believe that the relationship between the money stock and the price level does not only hold true in the UK in March of 2025,
but everywhere.
But everywhere, in all places.
What first attracted you to economics?
It was not through Austrian economics. So initially, I was interested in Keynesian macroeconomics. I found this fantastic. And I was a typical case. I mean, most young people who find Keynesian economics interesting is because the standard Keynesian models that you learn the first 2 years of your university studies, they they seduce you into dictatorship complex. You really get the impression that you know really how to work the whole system, and that you just have to pull this lever and push this button, and then things will be just fine. And only ignorant and stupid people and malicious people might have any different opinion. So this was really brought me in initially. It was the macroeconomic modeling. And then I discovered the Austrians really only by accident. It was after a few years down the road. And then, of course, once you found the Austrians, it's very difficult to get away from this.
But could I just go one step before that? So how did you get actually into, I mean, because of course you could have done anything in with your life in law or any other profession.
Yeah.
How did you get into the interest in markets and economics in the first place?
Well, I think it was by pure accident when I was at the military, military service. I mean, I don't know whether any one of you guys has ever done this, but
no.
This is.
I was in the Terriers at school. That was a pre. It was a sort of scout level, early fascistic, militaristic thing.
Yeah, good for you.
Selling biscuits door to door.
We basically cooked bacon in the open air. It was fantastic.
Yes, I would have loved that. That sounds like fun. But in our case, so there was no choice, and I was thoroughly bored. So I was looking for various things just to prop up my mood, and I don't know what to divert myself. And I followed an economics class. But hey, why not? My father was in sales, so I mean, he was working for a company. He was not a civil servant or something like this. And I said, okay, why not learn something about the economy? Maybe this is something for you for the future. And it was actually an economics class, standard economics class. We didn't do any modeling or something like this, but I found this interesting. And so I had to make up my mind then what I would do after the military time, and it was just 15 months, right? So I picked I had actually two things, right? One was to become a Lufthansa pilot.
Right.
So that was fun.
Yeah, I bet.
And I almost did it. But the application process was somewhat drawn out, and I had done so. It proceeded in two steps. One was the intelligence test, and so the cognitive abilities and so on. That was first, and so I passed that. And a few months down the road, and they sent me a letter. At the time, it was still letters, was no emails. And they said, well, we want you to come for the physical exam in Hamburg and bring your pen.
Right.
and so I almost did it. And they said, oh, no, you cannot do it. I mean, if you become a pilot, okay, you'll have tons of money, of all the beautiful girls, all the stewardesses with you, and you'll see interesting countries and so on. But by and large, you'll just be a bus driver. Right, a high-level bus driver, but I mean, that's what it is.
And, it is, yeah.
Yeah, and so I said, no, I mean, you cannot do it. You must do something else with your life. And so I stuck with my study program, which I started, which was a combination between mechanical engineering and management and economics, and which prepared for some industry activity. So before Lufthansa sent me their last letter, so I had to make my mind up between two programs that to me seemed to be interesting, and neither of them was a purebred one. So I was always just interested in some multidisciplinary stuff. One was law and economics, and the other one was mechanical engineering and economics. And then I didn't do law and economics because law seemed to be thoroughly boring. So I didn't want to learn paragraphs and deal with all these law books and so on. It seemed to be uninteresting. So I was more into the technical stuff. That's why I started. And then today, ironically, I'm running as a director a program called Law and Finance.
Right.
So I've come a long way.
In terms of, let's say, the popular understanding or lack of understanding of economics, would it be fair to say, is it a simplification to say that basically in the interwar and post-war years, there was basically a big intellectual fight between the Austrian school and the Keynesian school, and unfortunately for humanity, the Keynesians won that fight. Is that fair?
Yes, I mean it's a way of putting it. Although I would say that what was crucial was not really the weight of the intellectual arguments, but the ammunition that was delivered not by the people on the ground in the trenches, as you might say, so really the economists on the ground, but the people who are funding research. And
well, I'd say presumably it was the fact that government was far keener to absorb the Keynesian message because it gave them so much more power.
Yes, Tim. I mean that's part of it. But interestingly, what really got going right after World War I was funding of university research by private foundations, and especially the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation. So these guys really came in and they brought the big money, really big money. And
and that clearly had an agenda.
They had an agenda. And so there's really a fascinating story. You can find this easily on the internet. So there's this American social scientist by the name of Flexner, Flexner. He was advising the Rockefeller Foundation. And Flexner was thoroughly convinced personally that the way forward was to turn the social sciences into some sort of applied physics or applied mathematics. So really mimic what they were doing in physics, model building, and so on, data crunching. And that's the way forward for progress in economics, sociology, even psychology, and what have you. And so they put all this money into this. I mean, the Austrians benefited to some extent from it. Some of Mises' students were funded in the 1930s, Mises himself also to some extent. But the big bucks really went into this mathematization of economics program. It wasn't really an issue of political orientation, right? Of course, we associate Keynesianism with strong interventionism. But what they were really about is, so Rockefeller and the Ford Foundation at the time, they were trying to mathematize the social sciences. And a consequence of this was to get away from all these universals, right, that previously had held foreground in economics. From Adam Smith to the Austrians, economists are usually interested in causal relationships that they could understand by purely logical means, and which held true at all times in all places, but they were never really convinced that you could find any quantitative relationship that held true. Let's say like the gravitation constant, right? Something like this that you have in physics. No economist thought that you would have something like this in economics, right? But with the new orientation that was pushed by the foundations, research was geared toward finding such quantitative relationships and quantitative constants. And as a consequence, well, you never find them, but you always try something out, and you fall into some sort of practical nihilism, right? You can never know anything with certainty, except that you never know anything with certainty. And as a consequence, you also try all kinds of nonsense in politics. So that was really the connection, right? So there was outright Keynesianism, outright interventionism, but I think the indirect route, which comes from empiricism, right, exaggerated empiricism, was even more fateful.
I'm so glad that you mentioned this, because some of Paul's guests over the recent months we've had on the podcast have been Georgist. You're familiar with the Georgist movement?
You beat me to the punch there, Tim.
Yeah, because I thought, well, I'll let you take up the
No. Go ahead. No, it's great.
And basically, as someone who was unfamiliar with this until comparatively recently, not least through the people we've had on the show through Paul, is the idea that up until comparatively recently, economists would discuss things like land, labor, and capital. And then in the 19th century, presumably in direct response to the popularity of the Georgist movement, which advocated a land tax, land got basically stripped away from the whole debate. So because of landed interests in the UK Parliament, land got removed from the whole debate about how to tax people. An incredible story.
Yeah, interesting.
And this was, as you mentioned, coming at it from a different angle. This, what you were saying as the idea was that they would look at physics and economics in a very similar way. Instead of just saying, oh, well, this is an interesting idea, this concept was actually purposely done. There's a book called The Corruption of Economics by Fred Harrison that posits that this was actually done on purpose by said people like Rockefeller, who owned an enormous amount of land and therefore gave that land to the universities and therefore dictated what they could learn at those universities. And it's almost like, well, it sounds like a conspiracy theory until you look into it and realize, you can see why they might want to do that and why there are so many people that are scratching their heads about how economics doesn't quite work with the real world. And we seem to go from boom to bust, and policy decisions never seem to really be thought out for the long term. And you end up with this inequality in the system that creates a divide, but it helps the people who are the richest 1% at the majority of the time.
And does the author that you mentioned, does he demonstrate the intentions? Because that seems to be always difficult to do, right? If you have, you can see that they the kind of reforms and the kind of initiatives they took, that they were playing out in their interest. But were they conscious of what they were doing, and was this really the intention to draw attention away from the land question?
Well, yes, exactly that. Because the theory being that if you take the land that everybody owns, or the shared land, and you allow that to be taxed for the benefit of everybody, then the majority becomes wealthy. And so if you do that, you have a very wealthy system, a bit like in Norway, where they use the oil fund, and that benefits the people. It's not just an oligarch who owns the oil rights and therefore becomes so super wealthy, and then the majority of people become poor. So also, to this point, there's a guy who's kind of hit the scene, and there is differing opinions about him, but his name's Gary Stevenson, and he's come from a very poor background, went through the London School of Economics, managed to get a job at Citibank, became a very successful trader, and is now talking about how his goal is to get rid of inequality in the system. And what he's saying, in a different way, although he hasn't mentioned land, in a different way, he's saying the rich are becoming richer, and they are buying the assets of the middle class. And this is extending the poverty of it's pushing the middle class into more and more poverty. It explains why house prices are so expensive and why more and more people have to rent. And by the rich, he means people who've, over 5 or 10 million pounds plus, maybe more, because the more income you have, the more income it generates, the more assets you can buy, the more income that generates, the more assets you can buy. And it just goes this way. And he's not drawn that conclusion that it's the land. If you were to share the land, this wouldn't happen. But they had, and just as a final point, the Henry George, most people don't know who he is. Nobody talks about him. He's been airbrushed out of history, and he was bigger than presidents. So he was the most popular economist in the world. And we don't know. I didn't know about it until Akil and Phil Anderson came on our pods. So it's very similar to what you're talking about here, in the sense that you saw a problem with the economic system, and you say this doesn't work for this reason, and therefore you found something that has a better model for how things should work, to hold government into account. But they're looking at it from a slightly different perspective, and maybe one might say it is a conspiracy theory that is actually facts. You can look into it and do your own research, as they say.
That's correct. No, I also found that Henry George was a very clear writer, so it's interesting to read. It's convincing. I'm not an advocate of the Georgian land tax. But I mean, I mean, one thing is for sure that this would I mean, in many respects, right? I mean, his idea was just let's only tax land.
Yes.
And let's get rid of all the rest.
Yeah.
And that, of course, would be an enormous simplification and therefore improvement. Because we have a completely absurd system, which essentially, I mean, okay, you need to funnel some money to the government, maybe, okay, fine. But then let's make it simple. There's the idea of who's paying how much has been completely exaggerated in its importance, right? So in economics, there is the whole literature on the problem of the incidence of taxation. One great book on this is Murray Rothbard's book, 1970 book, Power and Market, and in which Rothbard explains, well, I mean, that those who seemingly seem to be paying the tax are not necessarily the people who are effectively paying the tax. For example, if you have a value-added tax, it seems to be a tax on the producer, so he's paying the additional amount of money, or sometimes it's presented as well as the customer, the consumer, who is paying the value-added tax. Right? The producers, they can deduce them and so on, but finally it's the consumer who pays. Well, it turns out it's not just the consumer who pays, everybody is paying, right? Also the capitalists on the road, and also the people who are contributing with their labor to the production process. Everybody is hit by that tax.
That's interesting.
And a colleague of mine in France, a great economist, Pascal Salam, who was an economist at the University of Paris, now has been retired for many years, but he has this great book with the title Tax Tyranny. So the book was translated a few years back, and I wrote a book review on this. And his central thesis is, why is it taxation tyrannical? Well, because you cannot really know who's paying how much. And that holds especially true of corporate taxation, taxation of capital in general. So the offshoot of all of this is it makes no sense to discuss, well, who is paying how much and so on, because you actually don't know. It depends on the circumstances. So who will be the eventual net payer and so on depends on the circumstances, depends on demand supply for various products, and this changes in a market economy constantly. You cannot anticipate this in advance. So therefore, forget about trying to be sophisticated and hyper just when it comes to this question. Just take your taxes somewhere in the economic system. It doesn't really matter where, and keep them low. Right? So, and that's really very much the spirit of George, right? It doesn't matter whether you tax labor, you tax capital, and so on, just make it simple. And he said, well, the simplest way to go about it is just taxing land, so everybody is somehow concerned. We're erecting the same barrier for everybody, so we're not really distorting the market, and so we avoid all the red tape and all the brouhaha, the administrative complications that we have today, where it takes almost a doctorate to fill out a tax declaration or an income tax declaration.
I didn't see it as a simplification. I saw it as nobody has a choice about whether they consume land, because we need it to live. Yes. And therefore, it's not something you can choose to buy like an iPhone or computer or car or anything else. Land is so important that and there's only a finite amount of it, and it can be improved by government spending, where the gains will go to those people who are close to wherever the, say, tube station or new facilities are being poured into, which is something that everybody's paying for. So the theory of it, the simplification wasn't just that it was about making one tax that is easy to collect or making the system simpler. It's about, this is something that we all need, and therefore it becomes distorted by people who are able to obtain more of it and effectively force other people out and not allow them into the game, as it were, because the inequality excuse me, just grows over time.
Yeah, that's the Georgian argument.
Yes, exactly.
But I was saying, so the reason why I like the argument is because of the simplification aspect.
Oh, right. I see.
To coin a phrase that was a slogan that was popular during the last few years, why pay tax if they can just print money?
Yes.
And I think we're maybe seeing the limitation of that logic in real time as we speak.
Yeah. And still, we haven't seen much, right? And we don't really wish that people see it very clearly before their eyes. But I mean, it's clearly this is not a good idea.
So can I ask you a difficult question that's a simple question? What is, to you, what is money? And can Bitcoin be money?
Money is a general medium of exchange. So I'm quite orthodox in that respect. Bitcoin could be a general medium of exchange. It presently is not, but potentially it could be. I don't think it's very probable, but I mean, from a technical point of view, there's no fundamental reason why it shouldn't be.
That's such an interesting answer, because we've heard people like Taleb saying you can't have Bitcoin as money because it's too volatile, but that's not. I've always argued against that.
Well, check out the purchasing power of all fiat currencies for the last 100 years.
Well, exactly. Look how volatile the Japanese yen's been recently, or or South American currencies, or what have you. But you just say simply one statement: it's just a medium of exchange. So anything could then become money, and has been in history.
Yes, lots of different things have been money, but of course, I mean, in the past 2,000 years or so, mainly we've been zooming in on the precious metals all over the world, right? It's just because by their physical characteristics, they're just very, very interesting media of exchange. It's difficult to compete with this. Now, Bitcoin is an interesting, very ingenious technical device, an artificial good, has been created a bit out of nothing. That somehow mimics the reasons why precious metals have been so widespread as media of exchange. And the interesting thing is, it's really very, very fascinating, because in Bitcoin you do have non-monetary users, right, which make Bitcoin interesting. For example, one thing is often neglected is that what Bitcoin really is a system, right? It's a payment system. People usually think of the units, the individual Bitcoin units and so on, but that's not really the value proposition of the whole thing. It's that you have a peer-to-peer final settlement system without any intermediaries. And what you really purchase when you purchase a Bitcoin, you purchase the possibility to participate in the payment system. And the other a service that you get is this time stamping service, which is also ingenious and has been new, right? So you get these non-monetary services that create an incentive to participate in the system, which is why Bitcoin currently is used as a financial asset. Now I understand that people feel very uncomfortable using Bitcoin as for their savings, right, as a way to invest their savings. Now, I personally do not own any Bitcoins either, so I'm too conservative for that. But I do understand that in the present landscape, where we have very high levels of indebtedness, that something like Bitcoin, which is not
inflationary.
Exactly, which is not inflationary and which doesn't carry any counterparty risk. That seems to be for me the most important aspect. Is interesting for investors. So I fully understand this. And once you are there, so there is a non-monetary starting point, yes, it could develop into a medium of exchange. There's nothing that fundamentally is opposed to this.
Given the way that precious metals and base metals have been rising of late, far-sighted people, Tim's fund, have been saying this for a long time, but as part of the Austrian school economics theory, is the world now playing out according to your beliefs in economics? And have you seen a renewed, or not a renewed interest, but a greater interest in Austrian school economics because of this? Because it's almost like the theory is playing out in real time and is starting to baffle traditional economists as to why the markets might be moving this way.
Well, I would say the one thing that has got most traction to Austrian economics in the past 2 years was the election of Javier Milei to the presidency of Argentina. So forget everything else around this, forget the movement of gold prices and so on, forget economic crisis, Silicon Valley, and I don't know, but none of this has really had quite the same traction. And then, of course, you have somebody who is really cracking down on overblown government like Trump, right? So he's unpacked the American chainsaw, and is now applying the metaphor, the Argentinian metaphor, to the case of the U.S. So, of course, this is in tune with what Austrians think, right, on the practical level, that you really don't need this, right? There's not much value, or if there's any, coming out of this. So, you should keep government small as possible. And there's nothing wrong with cutting it. It's, of course, there are negative consequences in the short run, especially for the people who are concerned, right? I mean, this destroys life. Let's be honest about this, right? This is terrible for the people who are concerned. But from an aggregate point of view, it's, of course, what Austrians believe is very healthy and very desirable.
Well, the other side of the equation is that there are many people who can't afford to pay taxes because, or are being taxed because of the inefficiency of government, and they're not able to flourish in an economy as well. So, yeah, I can see what you're saying, but you're cutting back in waste, no matter what your economic theory, and running it more like a business that has to stand on its own 2 feet seems like a far more sensible way. When you're spending other people's money, you're not going to be quite as, or you should. I think some people should be more careful with other people's money, but that's not how.
That's not human nature.
Well, it's not how certain people who've gone through the education system think. I guess there's a certain arrogance within politics that is kind of separated from running a business or being involved at the sharp end of the markets and having to trade and make decisions. And when they are kind of running government policy, they don't really think that they don't imagine that they're in a privileged position. They just think that they know what they're doing that's best for they think it's best for everybody, but it's just an arrogance of not understanding that really what they're doing is just wasting money. I mean, it's just incredible what's been uncovered so far, and what's to come. But it leads on.
And why would you expect the ordinary person who has never studied economics to know this if even the economists don't know it today? That's the problem that we have today. Right? All the professional economists, who are university professors and so on, they no longer learn economics. I mean, what they learn is some Keynesian models and so on, some microeconomic models in the first 2 years, and then they proceed very quickly to research, and research means modeling. It's just doing the same thing that any ignoramus, anybody who doesn't know the first thing about economics would do, try to model sequences of cause and effect, and then try to check them with data and so on. This doesn't work. But young economists no longer learn why it doesn't work. They no longer read the classics. They no longer read Adam Smith and David Ricardo. They no longer read Frédéric Bastiat and Alfred Marshall and so on. So how could they learn this? And if the professionals, don't know it, well, how would the typical average person do it? I mean, you need to have a very sharp mind and to be very keen in your observation in order to come spontaneously on the reasonings that economists have typically produced in the 19th century.
Do you think what's happening in the United States under Trump and Musk and Doge can be replicated in, say, Europe or the EU?
You mean politically or technically?
Well, the revelations about the incredible corruption and waste at the heart of the deep state can, and I was watching some of the Trump speech from the last few days, and it's staggering to see the bifurcation in, I think it's Congress, where you've got half of the House is applauding him and the other half is sitting there stony silent and with their arms crossed, and it's like we like there is a parallel universe. There's the universe in which we live, in which Elon Musk and Doge and USAID and people, revelations about millions and billions being spent on Peruvian transgender comics is finally coming to light. and the extraordinary corruption of the mainstream media, who've all been bought and paid for, at least in the US and wider afield than that. And then you have the other side, which is outraged that this is coming to light, and so it's like we're living in parallel universes.
Yes.
One of them is real, and the other one is a figment of an alternative reality for the last X years. It's quite astonishing to watch.
Yeah, and the basic problem is, of course, the corruption of the media, right? And to some extent, that's the result of the appearance of the internet, right? Because with the internet now, it becomes possible to obtain independent information, a great variety of information. That's the important thing, right? You have really competition among information providers. And because there's competition, then there are also reputation effects. So people who constantly tell you nonsense, you just don't pay attention anymore. And other people who provide reliable, interesting information, relevant information, well, you listen to them more. It's just a normal process. And our standard media, both print media and television and so on, they've been the first victims of this. So what do? Because the customers that they had previously in the 80s and also in the 90s, they were going away. So what do? Well, they get under the hood with the government. I mean, look at them. It's the same thing on both sides of the Atlantic. Our media, they receive large parts of their income through government contracts. And often they have CIA people and other Secret Service people sitting in the newsrooms and deciding what gets filtered out and what gets reported and so on. I mean, that's the basic problem. Right? We don't have any more independent media. We didn't allow for complete restructuring of the industry as it should have happened in light of the technological advance. I mean, there's no reason why we should keep all these print stuff and so on in existence. It only exists thanks to subsidies, and it is corrupt.
Do you think Trump 2.0 is a reflection of potential much broader change, or is it merely a blip, and the system will revert to what it was like under Biden?
Difficult to say.
Too early to say, you'd say.
It's too early to say, especially. I mean, let's be honest about this. Also, I mean, Trump, he's creating a huge mess, and that's wonderful. But of course, this will create also eventually a tide against, right? So, politics doesn't work one way. Streets over, especially if you have brutal and significant changes, that's the ones that we are observing right now. So, I expect the political pendulum to swing back at some point. Maybe not back to Biden. If Trump does a thorough job, he will destroy it so much that it will take years to rebuild, or even decades to rebuild.
Then he's got J.D. Vance right behind him.
Maybe. But again, right? I mean, the kind of policies they're leading right now, they will bring important fruit, but not right away, not over 2 or 3 years. I expect the most important consequences to follow over longer periods of time. That is, that the current administration and even J.D. Vance himself will not necessarily reap the fruit that he has sown.
So if you were in charge, would you do anything different, or would you reform the system in a different way?
Yeah, I would have started with the monetary system, because that's what I know best, and I know how very pernicious and harmful monetary intervention is. So central banking, fiat money, these are really very, very bad institutions, very harmful institutions. And the rot that they create, it infiltrates not only financial markets and banking,
but the broader culture.
But the broader culture. And that's a huge problem. So this must be tackled, and Trump doesn't have it on his radar screen. I'm not angry with him about this, because he's just human. Plus, he has very obvious personal limitations, right? He's rather imbued with himself. But I mean, can we reproach this to him, right? Because otherwise, he would never have had the stamina to stand up all the attacks and all the hostilities that were directed. I mean, you must be very full of yourself in order to withstand this for any significant amount of time. So he's impervious to economic reasoning. What can we do? So we need to be happy with what he's doing. It's much better than I expected. I'm very impressed with the methodical way that they're going about this, and with the amount of preparation that has been done this time. This is really wonderful. But I think in the long run, reform of the monetary system would carry even greater benefits. And if you keep the central banks in place, then of course they represent a threat to all the reforms of cutting down government that Trump is currently carrying out. And in the presence of central banks, you cannot achieve certain objectives that he has fixed himself. For example, I mean, one problem that you mentioned before is the redistribution of incomes and wealth from the bottom to the top, right? This will not go away with any. I mean, he can marginally change some of this. He can reduce taxes. He can reduce the nonsense of environmental policies that artificially increased costs of products consumed by the poorest households and so on. That's great. But the big problem that we have is that in an inflationary monetary system, labor systematically the value of labor is systematically discounted as compared to the value of shares in companies and as compared to real estate. That's just what it is. In an inflationary monetary system, people can no longer save in cash. And as a consequence, they need to protect their savings by a flight into real values. So they purchase real estate, they purchase any other durable goods, such shares in a company. So in an inflationary monetary system, the value of labor always comes at a discount, because labor is the one thing that you cannot store. You cannot stock it. You cannot accumulate it.
Interesting.
Right. Yeah, and that's the reason why labor suffers in inflationary monetary system more than any other asset, any other good. Well, precisely because it's not an asset.
So if you, to put it another way, then, if you had unlimited power, because you're saying what he hasn't done and you've forgiven him for that, but what if you had unlimited power? What would you actually do?
You know what Mises said when he was asked this question?
Oh, I didn't know he was asked the question.
Yes. What would you do if you were a dictator? And then he said, I would resign.
Right.
A great man. Right. So, I mean, who of us could resist this temptation?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose the theory is that you, no matter what you're doing, even with good intentions, the system will corrupt you, or there may be a way to corrupt you, which means you need to. It's like anyone who's going to be a good politician doesn't go into politics. I mean, I'm sure there is a few who went in with good intentions, but it seems to attract a certain type, and the good ones don't seem to last. But but in more so in a kind of technical question, because I'm wondering whether, to answer the question from before about learning, is the market going to school everybody else, and the Austrian school economics will be proven to be right? Is this what we're seeing here with the rise in real assets? The market is actually sending a message that this isn't going to go away. It's going to accelerate, and those of you who are not part of it or don't get it quick enough, you're going to be steamrolled out. Or is there something that can be done to fix the system that would make it so that it'd be fairer and the government could actually perform its duty in an efficient way, in a way that's best for everybody?
Let me answer in two steps, right? First, coming back to the dictator question. So if I were a dictator, I actually would do something very similar to what Mises did. Namely, I would not pursue any policy, but I would open it up. I would say, okay, I would decide that the Federal Reserve loses its monopoly position. They henceforth have to compete with foreign monies and with precious metals and with bitcoins and so on. So they're no longer protected against competition. And then Americans can sort it out for themselves. Households, firms, and so on, they're free to use whatever money they think fit. So in other words, what I think is important is that we don't try to solve all problems centrally. I mean, Elon Musk is considered to be by some people some sort of a genius like Einstein or something like this, and I think he's not. He's a very smart guy. He's a good person, I believe. But what we need is to mobilize the energies and the creativity of millions and millions of people. Many more smart people out there, and by cooperating, they can create results that no single genius could ever bring about.
Well, that's called the market.
Exactly, right? So I would say let's people sort them out. So tell them that they have all that they need, and they just figure it out, and government is no longer standing in the way. So that would be my approach. Now, the other question that you brought up was the idea that currently the evolution of stock markets and so on indicates that things are going in the right direction. I'm a bit wary of this sort of argument. I think the movement of stock markets in general is more reflective of what central banks are doing, or what people expect central banks to be doing in the near future, than of the real condition of the economy.
That's interesting.
Right? Look, in the past few years, right, American economy during the COVID years, right, the American economy has been languishing. Stock markets have been doing fine because they are on the life support system by the central bank. The central bank pursues an expansionary monetary policy. Well, this is likely to prop up everything that is all assets that are counted in money. It's not necessarily to the advantage of the real economy, so where wages are being paid and so on.
Tim, I could jump in, but we've only got about...
time is tight. So you've been very generous, Guido, in mentioning other writers. You have, we believe, you have recently published a new book.
Yes.
Can you say a bit about that?
Last year, I published a book with the title "Abundance, Generosity, and the State," and it's a general theory of gratuitous goods, so including gifts and so donations of time and of money. But also externalities and other side effect goods that come unintentionally and benefit other people. So it's really a whole roll up from the general theory of what gratuitous means, the theory of the gift, and then the relationship with the market economy, and especially, that was my main focus, the consequences of government interventionism on the economics of gratuitousness. And well, I'll let the readers discover this for themselves.
What would you say that somebody who was going to pick this book up, what would they learn from this? And because Tony Deedon talked about this book, and he said that it was a profound work that perhaps people wouldn't understand maybe for generations, but it sounds like this is a book that's going to stand the test of time, and people will look back and say, you know, this was an amazing piece of work, but perhaps we didn't really understand it at the time. What do you think people will get from it when they read it?
Well, Tony is very, very kind. He has been greatly supportive in bringing this book to the light and so on. So I'm very thankful for his kind words on this. Now, the background was that, I mean, to say in one word, nobody who was really in business will benefit from the book in conducting his business. That's not the point of the book, right? It's not a practical book in that sense.
Right.
But it's a book that helps you situate your own role in the economy and in the world as a market participant, as an entrepreneur, but also as a wage earner and so on, relative to government interventionism, relative to what everything is perceived to be non-economic, right? So very often, markets are conceived to be in opposition to the gift economy and uninterested behavior and so on. And what I show in the book is that there is a symbiotic relationship between everything that is non-paid for, so that is gratuitous, and the development of markets. The larger is the development of markets in the free economy, in which property rights are clearly developed, clearly defined. Right, the gratuitous part of the economy and the part that has to be paid for, they develop in unison. They develop organically together. And what we get if governments get involved, especially with monetary interventions, because that's what I discussed in the last part of the book. When monetary interventionism comes into play, of expansionary monetary policy, of inflationary regimes, then that leads to a dissociation, right? Then markets enter a mode of cancerous growth, which comes at the expense of all the other ways of interacting with other people in non-interested ways.
So government crowds out everybody else.
Exactly. Right. So that's the idea. And I show the I think it's probably the interesting element of the book that I show the mechanics. It's not just a certain things are so, but I show exactly what the economic mechanisms are that are behind this.
And allowing or getting rid of the central bank and allowing different types of money to be used, would that solve this problem? And as a second question, who would set interest rates in your ideal world?
The market, presumably.
Yes, everybody by interacting with each other, right? So, interest rates are market prices, right? So the exchange ratios that are created, well, of course, on the credit market on the one hand, but ultimately are created in the relationship between entrepreneurs, their customers, and their suppliers. And that's where the interest rate is really formed. It's not just on the loan market.
Right. But would the loan market have to actually change? Because the banks would have to potentially change their model in order to accommodate the fact that they could, in theory, get themselves into a lot of trouble by lending too much money in a short space of time and not having access to that cash.
But then the difference would be the banks would be allowed to fail, which then currently not under a central bank regime.
Yes.
Well, exactly. That was the road that I was going down in terms of it would keep them honest.
Well, in the current system, right, in Europe and also in the UK. So UK is part of the Europe in the larger sense, right? So I don't exclude you guys.
we do voluntarily though, Guido, don't worry.
So on this side of the Atlantic, banks play a huge role. It's almost like in Japan, and it's because they are artificially propped up by the central banking system, right? That's really the reason. If we had a free market in money and in finance, well, then banks would play a rather modest role because they could only lend at interest rates that would be worthwhile for the people who lend money to the banks themselves. Right? The bank is an intermediary, so it can only hand on money to other people that it has first received from others in a free market system. In the current system, they're creating money out of nothing, so they can let it artificially erase. So it's a huge competitive advantage for the banks, but they can do this, of course, only because you have the life support from the central bank. And the central bank can play this role only because their money is being forced on it. It's really pushed down our throats.
Are you critical of fractional reserve banking as well?
Yes.
If you were writing up the rules for how a bank could operate, what would be the kind of main headlines for how they should operate?
They have to be absolutely transparent about what they're doing, right? I mean, so we can discuss about fractional reserve banking back and forth all the time, but it boils really down to this. Are the banks absolutely clear about what they're doing? Now, some people like to gamble, and so they might enjoy having an account with a fractional reserve bank, and then Walter Blocker said, well, I mean, these guys are really purchasing a lottery ticket. Sometimes you get your money back, sometimes not. Okay, some people find this exciting. I wouldn't prevent them from doing this. But if banks are perfectly lucid about the kind of services they're providing, then most people would actually opt for 100% bank because that's what most people want. They don't want to play with money. They want to be sure that their money is available when they need it, which is why they have cash balances. Right? So, I mean, the important thing is not to go too much into theory and so on. That's important, but to be crystal clear about the definitions of the services and so on. And that's not at all what we currently have. I mean, look at any legislation, France, Germany, I guess in the UK, I've not looked into detail, but I think it's similar. The lawyers are not even able to define what a bank account is, what an account is. I mean,
our government has trouble identifying what a woman is. So that's where we are.
Absolutely. So would it be possible to, I had a thought experiment during the first financial crisis or the crisis of 2007, 2008, that if you could create such an institution as the one that you're describing here, and it would be, you couldn't just put your money in it at will. You couldn't move it out of your, risky account into this at will because, otherwise you could speculate and then just move it there whenever you wanted. But there needed to be something in the system that kept the rest of the system honest.
Well, to some extent, it already exists now, right? Because we have various providers of internet-based gold accounts. right? You can own a gold account or a silver account, right? And make payments out of that account. It's converted into dollars or into euros and so on. But the basic money that you're using is that, and it works on a 100% basis. Then there are all these payment services providers that have popped up in the past 15 to 17 years after the 2008 crisis. I remember at the time I was consulted by a guy who was formerly in banking and said, well, do you have any idea what the future of banking will be like? And it was, okay, I said, well, no, I really have no idea. My thoughts were also elsewhere. But I mean, in practice, we've seen in the past 15 years how things were going. And for me, this is really an amazing development. Namely, you have all these escrow accounts, right? You have payment providers who provide really only accounts to people. Lots of companies who are doing this N26 here on the European continent, and various other. In France, there was this company called Compte Nickel. They've been bought by Crédit Agricole and various others. So what they do is to provide just payment accounts to people. And this initially popped up because lots of small businesses were unable to obtain a regular bank account because they had gone bankrupt or had payment difficulties and so on. So no bank would convey them a regular bank account. So they were looking for alternatives. They got this. Now, all of this is escrow, right? So it's 100% covered. You have some small fee and so on that you pay, or sometimes there's also no fee associated with this, but it's all 100%, which shows, in my eyes, that if you leave people free to make their choices, and there's competition, that's the kind of product that they like. That's the kind of product that they need. Lots of people don't need a credit. I mean, many do, but I mean, lots of people who don't need, who can very well get along with a small business and so on. If you are wise in your cash management and so on, and I know entrepreneurs who have huge amounts of cash, right? 25% of the balance sheet is in cash. So they don't need a bank. They don't need credit because they finance everything out of the turnover.
I'd love to ask more questions. I'm just a bit worried about us going over time. Do you have any leeway for a little bit more?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I just double checked, so it's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So do you think would you advocate going back to a gold standard?
Well, I think the gold standard is better than what we had. I mean, of course, there's not the gold standard. There are lots, historically, we had lots of different gold standards. Now, the ones that we had historically were not really free market institutions, right? The classical gold standard is often held up as a shiny example of what a monetary system should be like. But it was highly contested in its day. So this is from the 1870s to World War I. So it was heavily contested in its day, and for perfectly good reasons. And it's not something that arose bottom up. Gold is simply not a suitable medium of exchange for most ordinary, for most people in the world, for ordinary people, because you cannot use it to purchase a cup of coffee or to do your groceries and so on, unless you have a very big family. You spend a lot of money. But if you're just a single person household or 2 or 3 person household, you don't need gold coins. And so you cannot use gold coins, actually. Right? So it's not really a medium of exchange. It was traditionally, it was always a reserve of value. And it was only thanks to government intervention that gold has been imposed as the standard base money of the monetary system. It was something that arranged very much the governments, because it forced everybody else into using money substitutes, in particular banknotes produced by commercial banks, by fractional reserve, commercial banks, accounting money, and so on. Right. So I'm not a big fan of the gold standard. I'm a fan of sound money. Sound money is something of a more general nature, and sound money comes into play if people are free to use the type of money that they think is best for them. So it's the consequence of monetary competition. It's not something that you devise with a top-down plan and impose on everybody else.
What do you think of that, Tim?
I completely agree. The only minor caveat I'd say would be that gold may not be appropriate as a sort of money for people, but silver could be, I think.
Yes. and that's why silver was, silver was really the standard money all over the world, right? Not only in Europe, not only in Latin America, but also in China, North America, and various African countries, and so on. Silver has traditionally been the most suitable medium of exchange. It's very difficult to beat silver. I mean, now we'll see whether Bitcoin and similar things might compete there. I have my doubts in a complete free market, but you would have to beat silver, which is pretty difficult.
What do you think the next few years will look like in the financial markets? Are we heading to some form of reckoning, or do you think the governments will sort things out in time?
I don't think our governments will sort anything out in time. My forecast has been for several years that if we run into trouble, well, they just pump up another layer of debt. And that's what we are currently seeing, right? With the Germans just conceding, well, we're creating this huge, we're reforming the law so that we may take out more public debt, which was until now prevented by the German law. So the things that the governments do is always to go the way of the least resistance, and that always goes through debt and the monetization of public debt. And if so, currently we're talking about national debt in Germany, in France, and now they are fantasizing about what great things they will do about this defense union or defense efforts and so on. And if this is no longer sufficient, then the European Union itself will obtain the authorization from the national governments to open up another big pond of public debt, which so far was not possible. But so I expect this is the way of the least resistance. Therefore, governments will go this. It's despairingly simple, but that's unfortunately how things are in this world.
So how close to the end do you think we might be? Do you think we're going to see a crisis?
I don't think we are close. I think we are at least 10 or 15 years removed from any serious trouble. Because we have very smart people running our central banks, right? And so as long as they find the right equilibrium between price inflation and public debt, they can go for a long while. So it is possible. But on the other hand, it's true, the situation can also get out of hand very quickly if there are significant alternatives, if there are better alternatives for people to use their money. And currently, that's what's protecting governments in the Western world, namely that there is no alternative to Western financial markets. Look, I mean, you can talk about China and South Korea and maybe a few African countries all you want, but I mean, these are not places where you can invest any significant amount of money. It's just not, the volume is not there. But if something better pops up, let's say Latin America follows Xavier Milei and they enact all radical free market reforms, Latin America becomes a free market paradise and is growing very strongly, well, this would absorb large amounts of wealth, and this could drain Europe of its present resources, and this would then force the hands of our politicians that they could no longer do the nonsense that they're currently doing.
So this big reckoning that eventually is going to happen, what do you think it will? What would it look like? Because we may have another crisis like 2008 very soon, but perhaps the system could survive it and will go into another phase. Would it be a whole new monetary system or a whole new currency? What would we see?
I expect the scenario that I find most probable for really a hard reckoning, right? The day of reckoning is that the governments are no longer able to serve the debt. I mean, I'm not talking about paying back the debt, but serving the debt out of their current income. Okay, so currently that's not the case because central banks are keeping interest rates low, but this is of course only possible as long as price inflation rates are relatively low. So at some point you run into the trade-off between high price inflation rates because central banks are opening the floodgates of the printing press, and the ability of governments to serve the public debt. All right, and that's the situation. That's the difficulty that we had each time in the past in all countries where you had a hyperinflation. There's the Swiss guy, Peter Bernholz. He's now retired for many years, but he published this wonderful book on monetary regimes and inflation in 2002 or 2003. And he walks through the entire experience of hyperinflations and demonstrates exactly that point. Right? At some point, it comes to a hyperinflation because governments, before the choice between their own survival and the stability of the currency, well, they choose their own survival. Then you get a hyperinflation. So that's what I anticipate. The only other alternative is complete socialization, right, to the totalitarian economy. But this is, of course, also a very short-run solution because you actually kill the economy, right? So you stabilize it by all-around regimentation or regulation, but you're really killing the economy. So I think that's the day of reckoning. How close is it? I think we're not yet close yet. It's certainly not in Europe. In the US, they were making great strides toward it because they had these incredible public deficits in the past few years. But even there, right, so you have so it's 25% new debt relative to GDP and so on. This is enormous, right? I mean, so these are the figures that you see before a hyperinflation. But even the Americans are not yet there, and especially now, if the current administration manages to keep spending down, especially new debt down, they will postpone that dreadful day.
Tim, have you? I just didn't want to hold.
I'm just basking in all this. This is fabulous to hear. I've nothing to add, so I'm happy to get a media picks if you like.
I just want to ask one final question, if I may. If somebody who's listening to this who might be studying economics at a prestigious university, or is just a very smart investor who wants to learn more about economics and doesn't want to follow the Keynesian route, would they start with one of your books, or where would be the best place to start?
I think the best book to learn economics is Rothbard's Man, Economy and State. It's a very big book, right? It's almost 1,000 pages. So it's a real treatise on economics, and you really learn it bottom up. And it is just the best textbook. Now, as far as technical questions is concerned, I mean, there are other things that you need to move a bit beyond this, but this will cover 95% or more of what people really need, also in their business.
So this is a practical book, you're saying?
It's a textbook.
And so how does your work fit with a book like that? Is it an extension of, or do you take the ideas further?
Well, in my book, so I'm looking. I mean, my book of last year, Abundance, Generosity, and the State. This looks at the economy from the point of view of non-interested behavior, right? Unselfish behavior, which is the opposite point of view as compared to the one from which we look at the economy usually. Usually we look at markets where we understand why people are interested in selling high and purchasing low and so on. And that's fine. This is also what Rothbard does in his book. And what I do in my book is to look at the same thing from the opposite point of view. Now, that's not necessarily what is practically the most helpful for people who are in the markets, right? It's important to gain perspective, but I wouldn't say this is, so the book that I published last year is the first book to which you should turn as a practical person. If you have intellectual interest, yes, this might be very, very interesting and very helpful, especially if you come, not from markets, but you come from, let's say, philosophy, sociology. You are an employee, so you don't need to make investment decisions and so on, because that's not the focus of that book.
It sounds almost like an anti-fragile type thought applied to economics, because it's something that's there, it's happening every day, but you just don't see it. And and what you've just said about effectively altruistic behavior in economics that's never really mentioned or measured. Something that now you've said it's quite obvious that it's there, but who would have thought to even look at that subject?
Yeah, and it is. I mean, since you mentioned this expression from Taleb, right? Anti-fragile. Yes, it is something that contributes to reinforcing robustness of organizations, also persons, right? Because it's this selfish economy, the altruistic economy, that provides a rock bottom, right, for interested activities, right? So the two must be in a balance, and that's of course the challenge for each person individually. But everyone knows deep inside, right, that you need to balance these two aspects of your life, right? You cannot just run after money, but you also cannot just be at the complete service of other people or some ideals and so on, right? You need to balance these two things. It's very important, right? And the biblical example is the metaphor of the parable of Martha and Mary, right? Mary Magdalene and Martha. The one is dedicated to spiritual, ideal concepts and so on. The other one is the busybody, is always doing something practical and so on. And so what you need in each person is a bit of both, right? So you cannot be just the purebred of either one of them.
It must be a real, it takes so much of your time to be writing a book. One of those things where you're just so pleased to finish it that you couldn't think about ever writing another one, but then suddenly ideas come and you feel like it's a cathartic experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's just something that you cannot, I cannot do without. So I need to do it. And it's not always a pleasant experience, because indeed I have many more ideas that I could ever bring to paper. And for me, I'm a slow writer, maybe also a slow thinker. So it just takes an inordinate amount of time to get anything decent done. So it's just, so I need to pick my topics. One thing that I book that I would like to write is a textbook on macroeconomics, focusing some of so elaborating a bit on what I'm doing in my classes here in Angers, but there's no textbook really that does exactly what I'm doing here. And the other book would be something on investment, right? The economics of investment, economics of finance, and so on. And this would be a digestion of my experience with Edelweiss, right? The wonderful company that Tony Deaton has created many years ago, and with which I've been associated for many years by now. So I'm in the board of Edelweiss, for full disclosure. So this is a commercial now, right? But so Edelweiss really is this unique investment philosophy and investment approach. And there is no real conceptual clarity on this. So I need someone who needs to express this in terms that economists would be familiar with, and explain exactly why this is a fruitful approach and not a dead end like standard neoclassical theory of finance.
That sounds absolutely amazing. I really hope you write that book. That would be, I think that would fly off the shelves as well. Because of obviously the reputation, but that would be just so interesting. As I'm sure, the other more, there's always need for a macroeconomic textbook that's been written in a way that
with realism.
Exactly. Because I studied economics at school, and I realised that it just didn't make sense to me. And again, it takes a long time to have the experience to know what's right or wrong. And then once you're in that period, a lot of people have either working in a bank or just doing something else that they wouldn't have the time to, or maybe the inclination to actually set it all or put it all right. But you have the power to do that. So that would be absolutely amazing. But I think time is moving on. So I don't want to keep you, Guido, but maybe we could go to media picks. Tim.
Yeah, I'll start. So this recent discussion about new book plans reminds me of an occasion at school when we had a best-selling children's author was invited in to speak, I can't remember the name of the author, but he'd written things that you may well have read, and it was bestseller anyway.
The German Minister of the Economy.
And one of the kids in the audience just said, "Are you going to write a book about the Beatles?" Anyway, that wasn't very well. We had a laugh about it, but I don't think the question was very well received by the author. So mine for this week is a blog. It's a commentary piece.
Yeah.
It's actually just a recommendation for a website. Guido, do you know brownstone.org?
Yes, I do. Actually, I've known the founder and president of Brownstone for many years, for almost 30 years.
Jeffrey Tucker.
Yes. Yeah.
So I suspect this piece was published, or this sequence of commentaries was published anonymously, but I suspect that a heavy hand of Jeffrey Tucker was involved in a large part. But it's on the brownstone.org website, so brownstone.org, and it's basically just called COVID Response at 5 years. It's a selection of commentaries, but it's in meticulous detail. It just shows how mad the world became, and it's difficult now to recall just what we've lived through for the last 5 years, but it's called COVID Response at 5 years, and it's available at brownstone.org, and I'd recommend it to anybody.
Amazing. Sorry, Tim, by the way, about that joke that you made, because I was just looking something up about what my media pick might be, and I didn't quite hear, so I'm sure it's a great joke.
There's a long-standing history of me putting out what other people would consider zingers, and for me they're like heavy metal. They're like lead bound missiles that go straight through the surface of the earth and detonate around the center of the earth, and everyone just goes, what was that? It was my leaden attempt at humor. So I'm glad to be keeping that tradition strong in this podcast.
Guido, by the way, just before we go to your media pick, I should have asked you, was there anything else that we hadn't asked you that you wanted to mention on the pod?
Oh, wait a minute. We covered a lot of ground.
We did, yeah.
Okay. The most common misconception in economics.
Yeah.
I make it very short and sweet. Right? The most common misconception is that the economy works particularly well if you have a stable level of prices or slightly increasing price level. This you find everywhere in all textbooks on money and banking, all macroeconomics textbooks. Whenever people are philosophizing about investors, are philosophizing about economics, and then they talk about the monetary framework. Yes, we have the central banks. We need to keep the purchasing power of money stable, and so on. All of this is nonsense, right? In a free market situation, the standard scenario would be one of a price deflationary movement, right? In a free market economy is a price deflationary economy, and I encourage your audience to take a look at the Austrian literature there, and I've myself contributed to it, various papers and chapters in my books and so on. And one of my friends, Professor Philipp Bagus from the University of Madrid, he has written a book in defense of deflation. Joe Salerno in the US at the Mises Institute has also explained the importance of deflation and distinguished free market deflation and coercive deflation, so interventionist deflation and so on. So this is very, very important that people come to make up their minds on this, and that they understand that in a free market, price deflation is normal, it's natural, and it actually carries lots of social benefits, because in a price deflationary economy, benefits are distributed bottom up, whereas in a price inflationary system, which we currently have, we get the opposite effect, right? There's no trickle down, there's always trickle up. Right? So there's wealth, and it's redistributed from the bottom to the top of the political and economic food chain.
Yeah,
this is the problem, that under a central banking inflation regime, that can never happen, sadly.
Exactly. And it's actually the central banks, if you read their own pronouncements on both sides of the Atlantic, and I guess in other parts of the world as well, they represented as one of their core missions to prevent that price deflation ever happen.
Right.
And this is absolutely disastrous, right? And it flies into the face of all sound economic theory, and in this flies also in the face of historical experience. Because in the 19th century, we had, under the gold standard, but even before the gold standard, we had price deflationary experiences, protracted price deflationary experiences in various countries. And these were most notably the periods of our economic development, of our economic history, where we had the highest growth rates.
Then do you think that it is a conspiracy that things aren't done correctly because of the wealth? Do you think it's just the way the system has developed, just because the most powerful people have money and those influence government? Or is it ignorance?
Paul, as usual, it's a mixture between all of these things, right? Of course, there are people who are self-interested behind this, and they've been funding this and funding research and going in this direction and so on. Then there's ignorance, and then there's also honest error. Economists are not perfect, so of course you always screw up somewhere. And there are very smart and sometimes also brilliant economists working for central banks and similar institutions who honestly believe, for the wrong reasons, that the stabilization of the price level is beneficial for the economy as a whole, and that's exactly how it should be. So it's a mixture.
Yeah, amazing. That's brilliant. So you sort of gave us a media pick earlier, which was the economics textbook. But
yes,
if you wanted to give another one or more, that's absolutely fine.
Okay. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 media picks for you.
Amazing.
In fact,
it's hyperinflation in real time.
So I only have 3, but since you started with this COVID thing, I was thinking of a book that I read recently by my good friend Thomas Woods, who has published a compilation of his daily thoughts and comments of the COVID mania. And the title of the book is Diary of a Psychosis.
Right.
How public health disgraced itself during COVID mania.
Wow.
And it has a foreword by Jay Bhattacharya, who is now involved with the current American administration, I understand. And it's a wonderful book. I mean, it's somewhat painful, right? Because going through the pages, you re-experience the times that we all would like to forget, which were dreadful. But he lays it out, and I think it's a book that everybody should have in his library, just for the record, right? So that you can go back and say, okay, how was it really during those? Because he quotes his sources, lays out the data, so you have it there, black on white. So this is my first pick.
Brilliant. I'm getting that.
A second pick is by one of the brilliant economists teaching at my master program in Angers. His name is Nikolay Gertchev, Gertchev. And Nikolay is working for the European Union. That's not for the Commission, right? So that's not really to his credit, but I mean, he's really a very smart, very brilliant guy. Has been involved with financial market operations, oversight, policies, and so on for many years. And he has published this book on the evolution of banking regulation in the European Union. Now, that's a sort of a technical book, so it's not for a broad public, but since you have a finance blog and a finance audio show, I mean, this might be interesting for many of your readers, because Nikolay goes through the economic rationale of banking regulation. And it shows that ultimately the mainspring of it is the irresponsibility that is introduced into the whole banking system, into the financial system, through inflationary monetary interventions. That's really the root. And if we didn't have those, we wouldn't need the banking regulation. And if we do not get rid of such policies, then any sort of banking regulation is ultimately inefficient. It just doesn't work. So that's what he demonstrates in this wonderful book, and he walks through all the standard. He follows the standard outline on banking regulation, right? So he talks about the micro regulation and the macro, right? Macro-prudential regulation and financial stability, micro-prudential regulation and supervision, all these things, right? And he puts this into the context of Austrian monetary economics. Great book. In a similar vein, I would recommend, now this is more interesting for a larger public already, a book by Philipp Bagus, whom I already mentioned a few minutes ago. So he has been involved in an intellectual feud in Spain, where he teaches. Debate with another brilliant author. His name is Juan Rallo. Rallo is Austrian economist, but defender of fractional reserve banking. So the two were battling it out. Rallo has published only in Spanish, and Philip has just published a short booklet, some 100 pages, 120, 150 pages, presenting his arguments against fractional reserve banking, and in so doing discusses topics that are of great interest for economics in general, most notably the importance of savings. And this is a topic that you never hear about in the standard macro text that students never confronted with. And so Philip presents all of this in a very accessible way in the short book.
So a lot of the time when you're teaching, you must be saying, well, the textbooks say this, but this isn't right. This is what you should be focused on, right?
Yes. So that's how I always have to start off. Right? So standard teaching today is that savings actually don't count for much, right? I mean, economic growth is only to a very small part is due to savings. And the largest part is due to technological progress, right? That's the standard pitch that is conveyed in all macroeconomics textbooks. And I think it's wrong, right? And it's wrong. I mean, the demonstration has not changed much. It goes with by correlations, right? It's a way the variation of spending on R&D is more strongly correlated with economic growth than the variation of savings. Okay. Now, this is somewhat like saying the variation of GDP is not very strongly correlated with the oxygen content in the atmosphere, which is correct. I think there's actually a zero correlation between the two variables. But nobody would think, because of this, that there's no causal connection between the oxygen content of the atmosphere and economic growth. Right? It's just stupid to say this. So it's not because you have a high correlation that this is significant, economically significant. And it's not because you have no correlation that this is economically uninteresting. In any case, all the classical economists that were convinced that savings are absolutely fundamental for economic growth. Just take a casual look at Adam Smith, you will see that that was his conviction. And certainly that's also the conviction of Ludwig von Mises and all the Austrian economists of our day.
There is a correlation, though, between suicides in America and the release of Nicolas Cage movies.
Yes, it's the correlation causation thing, isn't it?
Okay, my last book for you guys. This is more general, and it's a book by two philosophers, Michael Esfeld from the University of Lausanne and Christian Lopez, also from the University of Lausanne. They've published this book, Restoring Science and the Rule of Law. And the book also comes right out of this COVID experience. So Michael Esfeld is a member of the German Academy of Science, and got into big trouble with his colleagues during the COVID years because he felt that the Academy was overstepping the boundaries of its scientific competence in endorsing all these COVID policies for which there was no evidence. There was no evidence whatsoever. And so he was so frustrated that they started to look for the explanations, political explanations, what experience, right? Where does this come from? And he stumbled on Austrian economics and Austrian political philosophy, anarcho-capitalism, and so on. And he realized that the problem really comes from government meddling with science. And in his book, he presents that while science can only thrive as a cultural common, it can only thrive if there's completely free access to the field. There are no public subsidies, no prohibitions, and also no subsidies to any of the players. So science must be completely free, must be privately funded, and that's the best guarantee to have truth emerge in the competition, in the honest competition, uninterested competition of the participants. And so that's my way of putting it. You wouldn't quite phrase it the same way, but it's been published with Palgrave Macmillan just last year, Restoring Science and the Rule of Law.
All I can say is, how lucky are your students to have someone like you teaching them? Do they realize how lucky they are?
Well, you're very kind. I don't know.
Well, I'm just thinking back to when I did economics, and it's not that it's I quite enjoyed it as a subject, but to have such a deep understanding of all the moving parts and all the flaws of the current system, and to be able to explain that to them, I guess they wouldn't know unless they'd studied it elsewhere and then could compare it, which is often the case.
Well, some do like it. It's true.
Yeah, but brilliant. Well, for people who want to find you and or would like to connect with you, are you on any of the social media platforms?
No, I don't do social media.
Well, that's kind of a very sensible thing. Okay, but if they wanted to read up more about your work, I guess they could just find your books. You don't have a website or anything that they could go to?
I do have a website. So yeah. If you just type GuidoHülsmann.com, GuidoHülsmann.com.
Fantastic. Well, that'll be the first link in the show notes for everybody to click on to find more information about you. I hope you do write those books in the future, and I also really hope that you come back on the podcast. It's been a real honor.
With pleasure. Always a pleasure to be with you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Guido.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Please do your own research or contact a professional advisor.